I just know this, that I've spent a long time doing this. At the beginning, as I've mentioned, I was skeptical and didn't even want to do it, said no. And even after I did it, and I had all these materials at my disposal, and I had access to all the science and all the images and everything else, with all that, I don't believe that I was on that team for any other reason than, yeah, to make some photographs in 1978, but more importantly, to bring all this information to people like Dale, to whom this is important. And look, I believe I was on that team, like I said, not in spite of being a Jew, but because of it. Because who better than a Jewish guy with no emotional attachment or interest in the subject could become a spokesman for the science of the shroud, which is really what I've become. So I think that my job, look, I'm working on a book.
Welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we have a very special event. It's an event in the making. It's a tribute celebrating the life and legacy of all of our mutual friends, Barrie Schwortz, who is no stranger in the Shroud community. He's someone I've had massive respect for. He played a role in bringing me to faith in Jesus through his incredible knowledge on the Shroud. So yeah, what we've done today, I've brought together a bunch of Shroud experts, people from all walks of life, Christian, non-Christian, pro-Shroud, Shroud skeptic, and we're all here together to honor Barrie Schwortz and his legacy. So what we're going to do, the plan of action, you can see I have a whole panel of guests here, and we're just going to go around and give about 10 minutes or so to each of the guests to share stories about Barrie Schwortz and kind of honor his memory and what Barrie meant to them personally. So that's sort of the plan of action for today. And the first thing I want to do is hand it over to the person who probably had the most contact with Barrie in his final days and has actually taken over for Barrie a lot of his responsibilities. So Joe Marino, I think you deserve to go first and give your take on Barrie there. So yeah, over to you. And just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dale. Okay. Boy, it's like, where do you start with Barrie? He was just an amazing guy. And, one of the first thoughts I had was Barrie was the one that, did the in memoriams for everybody else. It just doesn't seem like we should be having to do one for him. But, he talked about, obviously he knew he wasn't going to be around forever, but, we were all hoping, especially given that he had enjoyed pretty good health all of his life. He wasn't on any medicines or anything, but I think we all just sort of thought that he could kind of almost go on forever. But he was really dedicated to what he did. I mean, he was working for many years. I think he slowed down a little at the end, but for many years he was working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And he would tell me things like, he says, "Oh, I gotta get my eyes checked. I could tell my vision's changing." And, and I'd ask him if he'd made it his appointment. He's, "Oh, no, I'll get around to it." He was always so dedicated to the job that he let things like that go to a lower priority than they should have. But he touched the lives of so many people. And now that I'm seeing the Shroud.com emails come in and stuff, I mean, there's people that I've never heard of that are just giving these heartfelt testimonies about how, Barrie would spend hours on the phone with them and, um, help them so much. And, as busy as he would always, it was rare that, that you could get off with less than an hour with a phone conversation with Barrie. I mean, um, he was just so giving of his time to so many people, um, and it's going to be hard to do that in memoriam for him. But I've already gathered quite a few quotes. Instead of doing just a regular in memoriam, I'm working with a group of other people, including some of the people on the program today. We're going to try to do kind of an extra special Barrie Schwortz page instead of just the minimum in memoriam that most people get. But if anybody deserves it, it's Barrie. He was probably had the best relationship with the Turin authorities of any American. He endured quite a bit of unfair treatment over the years that probably got me more upset than it did him. But I mean, you had an unnamed lawyer that was telling the people in Turin that Barrie was making millions off the photographs, and the Turin authorities believed that guy for a while. And then a priest from Rome came over and visited Barrie and saw his modest house and the 1997 car he was still driving, and realized that that person had lied to the Turin authorities about Barrie making money. And then there was another unnamed scientist over the pond that was really nasty to Barrie in some of the postings on an internet group, and he would in place of S's, he would put the $, which just infuriated me. But Barrie was able to kind of roll with it and kind of expected it as part of his job and stuff. But he was very diplomatic. If people would send him stuff all the time, books and theories, and I see this and I see that, and you have to have a lot of patience to deal with that over 28 years. But Barrie just had a way about him that he would say, well, I don't deny that can happen. That may be God's personal message to you, and that's that sort of thing. But he had been trained by Ray Rogers to be careful of the "I think I see" syndrome that a lot of Shroud people have. But he was also really a spokesman really for the whole Shroud world, and it was kind of funny. I think around 2015 or 16, he spoke to I think it was 35,000 Ahmadiyya Muslims, and he kind of noted the irony that here he was a Jew speaking about a Christian relic to Muslims. Who else could pull that off but Barrie? He had a great sense of humor. We discovered relatively late in our relationship that I kept I've always been a punster, as most of you people here know, and I somehow I kept it under wraps for a long time, and it finally came out. It was all in a gush in the later years with him, and he joined. I have a pun group. A couple of the people here are on that, and Barrie joined that, and threw in some witty responses sometimes to the original puns. He was a connoisseur of words, very articulate, very erudite, smart as a whip. I don't know. like I say, he was, no matter how busy he was, he had time for people from California tell me that, they were working on a documentary, and Barrie would start off and say, "Oh, I'm just so super busy, I can't stay on long." And of course, he'd spend an hour or so with them on the phone anyway, and they were amazed at how much time he gave them. But he was just a prince of a man, and I'm going to miss him terribly. I did talk to him a few times, during his illness, and it was really sad because his son David told me that when he went to the hospital, um, when David took him on May 19th, Barrie told David that he thought the doctor would just give him some medicine and he could go home. But of course, he went to the rehab and never even got home. And I feel so bad that he never got to see his 3 cats again, which he loved those cats. And fortunately, a neighbor of his adopted all 3 for him. But he was a prince of a guy, and that's I'll just leave it at that for now.
All right. Hang on. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate that. So at this point, we do have 3 panelists that do need to give their speeches, and then they have to leave early. So I want to go with them first, just to respect their time. And first we have up Bill Meacham. So over to you if you unmute yourself there. Oh, I have to unmute you. So yeah, go ahead.
Anyway, it's a photo. I can send it to anybody who's interested. That was taken in 2007 when Barrie was visiting here in Hong Kong. He was he had been to the Philippines for a trip. He was invited by a group in the Philippines to give a talk and introduce an exhibit that they had prepared, or I think he had helped them prepare the exhibit. And then he came to Hong Kong for a visit and stayed in one. At that time, I had 2 apartments, so I put him in one over in Happy Valley. And I think it was in Happy Valley. Maybe it was this. Anyway, he stayed in one, and we went out. I took him out to several sites to see in Hong Kong, one of which was some Bronze Age rock carvings that he was most interested in. But on the way back, one thing that struck me was I was showing him some sites in Aberdeen, which is an old fishing community where there's a lot of boat people that live on boats, people that live on stilts. And I was pointing things out, and he started chatting with a woman there who spoke English, Chinese woman. And I would say, over there, and he glanced, and then he was more interested in talking to that woman than seeing the sights. And I thought, oh, that's kind of typical of Barrie. He was a people person, as maybe more than just a sightseer. But we had a good time. We went out to dinner, and he met my girlfriend at the time, and he stayed for I think 3 or 4 days. Met my dogs, so that was a good visit and a good chance to get to know him better. I met Barrie in person in 1996 when I visited Los Angeles with my girlfriend, and we stayed. Well, we didn't stay with him, but we visited him in his flat or his apartment or his house. I forget. I think it was a building, and he had 1 floor. I'm not sure if that. I mean, he was telling us when we were there that every night at about 7 o'clock he would lock it up tight, and he had several guns that he kept in the place. I think he kept one in his bedroom. Maybe somebody else knows more about it, but he said, yeah, it can be a dangerous neighborhood. So he had a kind of a fortress in Los Angeles. And he also took us out to meet Isabel, and we had dinner with her, and we had a long conversation there. And we were discussing whether it's possible to get DNA off the shroud that would be accurate, that would belong to the man of the image of the shroud. And people next to us were kind of eavesdropping, and finally they said, that is such an interesting conversation. And Barrie started talking to them for the next 5 minutes. So that was really my first encounter with him personally, although we had some correspondence. I even tried to find a letter because the first correspondence I think I had was by letter rather than email. I only got email in about 95, I think it was. And then we, of course, corresponded by email after that. So, and like other people have already have pointed out many times, Barrie loved to talk on the phone. And many times I had conversations with him that I thought might go 20 or 30 minutes. I had something to ask him, and it would go an hour or two. And he would share stuff that was not supposed to be shared. He said, "Now this is strictly between us." Okay. And I would share stuff with him, and he never once told anybody else what I told him, some of the stuff. And I would ask him about things that were going on. And there were certain things he couldn't say. And he would say, "I'd like to tell you, but I can't. It's under confidence." But we had, I would say, 20 or 30 conversations that lasted an hour or two. So for me, it was a great introduction to the Shroud world that I sort of broke into in the 80s. And when I met Barrie in the 90s, it was a great way to get involved and know more about what was going on.
All right, cool. So let's move on to the next. Jack Marquardt, over to you there. And Jack, I know he's, I was telling people behind the stage, he's a trooper because he's not only on today, but he'll be on tomorrow debating Hugh Ferry on the Shroud history. But yeah, over to you, Jack, for your take on Barrie there.
I don't know how to follow Bill Meacham, but I'll try. Well, for many years, I spent a lot of quality time with Barrie Schwortz at numerous Shroud conferences and presentations. And like many others, I engaged in marathon telephone conversations with him. We would, of course, always speak about Shroud research and syndonology in general. But Barrie, who was a self-described old hippie, he was prone to going off about philosophizing on almost anything and everything. I first met him in 1998 on a pilgrimage from Rome to Turin, where the Shroud was then being exhibited, and there was an international Shroud conference that year. And Barrie was serving as a lecturer and giving Shroud presentations both on the bus and at the hotel. And as usual, his talks were informative and entertaining. But I think far more importantly, he would constantly move from one end of the bus to the other. And along the way, he would sit down and he would strike up conversations with his fellow travelers. He would ask them about themselves and their families and their lives and their interests and their concerns. And he would also dine with his newly made friends because that's what they instantly became to him. And you could always hear loud laughter from whatever table he was sitting at when he was taking his meals. And somehow, I don't know exactly how, but he was always able to remember everyone's name. He never forgot the details of what he learned about them. And by the time that we got to Turin, which was about a week later, every single pilgrim on that bus had Barrie's contact information. He had theirs. And I have no doubt that most of them stayed in touch with him thereafter. Now, from that experience, I learned that Barrie was a kind, warm, wonderful, and very caring person. And in the following years, I saw that this is precisely how he treated everybody, wherever he went and in whatever he did. In 2014, my wife and I attended a Shroud presentation which Barrie gave in Savannah, Georgia. As usual, it was done to perfection. It was very well received by the large audience that was in attendance. And afterwards, we met with Barrie and one of his closest friends. It was a celebrated Army officer who lived in that area and whose family had come from Poland. And at that time, Barrie went into great detail about his own Polish roots and a visit which he had made to Poland. And he also shared many of his experiences from childhood and his upbringing. And from this conversation, I learned that Barrie deeply loved his mother, from whom he had undoubtedly obtained his very unique philosophy and remarkable wisdom, and that he was very proud of and loyal to his ethnic and religious heritage. In addition to his admirable human qualities, Barrie was a first-rate, albeit very modest thinker and scholar who was very committed to intellectual honesty. All of his views were highly objective. They were based on solid evidence. He never expressed an opinion without having first considered the matter carefully, and he never wavered in advocating and defending his positions. Indeed, about a week before his death, I called Barrie to ask him a question about a statement that was once made by Ray Rogers concerning a historical matter. In this case, it was the Darcy Memorandum. And it was then that I learned for the first time of his health issues, and he told me he was going into the hospital the next day. Then later in our conversation, he asked me about my question, why I called him. And I told him that was no longer important. It wasn't necessary to discuss it, but he insisted that I go ahead and ask him the question. So I did. Now, Barrie was a very close friend and colleague of Ray Rogers, but he said that on this matter, Ray had misspoken. And so to the very end, Barrie's commitment to intellectual honesty remained paramount to everything else, which is something I really respected about him. Barrie's final words to me were precisely the words that he used that ended every one of our conversations. Now, my wife's name is Joanne, and Barrie said in a very weak and raspy voice, "Give Joanne a big kiss for me." Now, that was the quintessential Barrie Schwortz. That was the Barrie Schwortz that I know, and I think that most people knew. Everyone knows Barrie's Shroud legacy, his service on Stirp, his world-famous photographs, his incredible Shroud of Turin website, and his outstanding writings and his interviews. However, I hope that people also appreciate that everything which Barrie did in regard to the Shroud, he did in his God-given role as an advocate and an evangelist for its authenticity. I often told him that although he was of Jewish faith, I thought him to be, in both his words and his actions, more Christian than most Christians I knew, and never once did he protest this observation. I will always remember him with great love and admiration, and I pray that his gentle hippie soul may forever rest in peace. So I'd like to thank you, Dale, for organizing this tribute to Barrie and for giving his friends an opportunity to recount a little bit about the good man whom we were all so very privileged and blessed to know.
All right, thank you so much, Jack. And next up, we'll have Dr. Ken Stevenson there. So, yep, over to you there, Ken.
I want to start by saying that Barrie and I actually grew up minutes from each other in the city of Pittsburgh, and never knew that, of course, until we got to meet and talk. I had the privilege some years ago to do a joint presentation with Barrie in the city of Pittsburgh, and his mother was in attendance. And as he shared with me afterwards, he was very nervous about what his mother would say to him. And as he said, she remained uncharacteristically quiet in the ride back home. So he eventually said, "Mom, what do you think?" And he said to me that his mother's response was, "Of course it's Jesus. Why else would they keep it?" My first encounter with Barrie was on the flight to Turin. And like everybody said, really good conversationalist. We had wonderful conversation all the way there. And he asked me how I felt about it. He even shared some of his misgivings and how they kind of pressed him to come. I shared my faith with him. As I did, Barrie said to me, "Wow, Ken, I'm getting chills listening to you share your faith." Again, very fascinating coming from a Jewish perspective. And when we got in Turin and finally got to do the testing, Barrie worked nonstop. I doubt he got more than a handful of hours of sleep during the week of the testing. And he came by me snapping furiously. And he said to me at that point, he said, "Ken, it's happening all over again. I'm getting chills." People mentioned the fact that Barrie caught a lot of grief. I was the spokesman and the editor for STIRP, and at one point was tasked along with the late Father. I'm drawing a mental blank here for a minute. It'll come back to me. No, not Father Rinaldi. My beautiful wife has given me some help. But anyway, we were to jointly write the team book. Another individual who will remain unnamed was added. And I, as the spokesman and editor, had received a contact from Houghton Mifflin. And they wanted to offer us a contract to do the team book. I was living in New Orleans at the time, and this third individual called the other two of us and said, "You don't have to come. I live in Connecticut. I'll go down and meet with them." Later, he told us and STIRP that it was just a preliminary. There was no real interest and da-da-da-da-da. And as a result, the team book went away, which, as Gary Habermas can share, gave us the liberty to write our own book. Unfortunately, that individual chose that opportunity to lie about my book. Barrie and Rudy Dichtel stood up in front of STIRP and said, "This is not right. What you've done is unfair." Barrie had my back like no one else. And I find it rather fascinating that I probably, along with Rudy Dichtel, attended one of Barrie's last presentations on the Shroud. There's a museum in Houston that I'd never heard of. It's a Museum of Funeral History, National Museum here in America. Barrie and Rudy had been invited. And Barrie said to them, "Hey, Ken Stevenson lives in Texas. You need to have him come down as well." And when we got there, someone mentioned earlier his role and how he kept to his role. They asked us questions after the presentation, and they asked Barrie a spiritual question. And his response was, "Ken needs to answer that." I agree. You couldn't talk for Barrie for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. If you got on the phone with him, even if he was very busy, you would be on the phone for a minimum of an hour. I also agree that he always said, "Give Mary a big hug and kiss from me." Barrie was a very personal guy. And when I learned about him going to the Ahmadiyya Muslims, that to me was the icing on the cake, because it really, truly was an incredible thing for a Jewish person to go to a massive Muslim group. And I think the last time he spoke there, it was for over 50,000 Muslims. And he got to meet with their equivalent of Pope, the highest imam in their part of the Muslim denomination. And he had a personal meeting with him, and he shared with me many things about that personal meeting. And he said, "Isn't it like God that I, a Jew, would come to the Muslims to speak about Jesus?" That indeed was Barrie Schwortz. But I also want to tell you a little bit of a personal story. We were blessed, Mary and I, to have 3 of our 4 children with us in Turin. And one of my boys, Sean, who unfortunately is no longer with us, he was taken from us unjustly a few years back, earned the nickname from Barrie, Bam Bam. And it was a well-earned nickname. Bam Bam really was Sean's behavior as a excited young 3-year-old in Italy. A personal revelation about a dear friend that I will miss. A lot of people wonder if Barrie actually believed in Jesus. And I've heard people say, well, he never came out and publicly confessed to be a Christian. But I like what I think it was Mark shared a little while ago. Barrie was an evangelist with his work with the Shroud. How else would you describe a person sharing the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ with 50,000 Muslims? How else would you describe it? And the fascinating thing is, I believe I met that group of Muslims as the spokesman for STIRP. We had gone to a conference in London, and I handled all the media. When I went out, there was a group of Muslims who approached me, and I was fascinated. And I said, why would you be interested in a Christian relic? And they said to me, we believe Jesus was a prophet. And so therefore, if this is his garment, it would be a holy relic to us as well. And so then I understood why we're there. And now I say, I believe Barrie was the one to take that story back to them years later and share the evidence of a Christian relic with a group of Muslims. It might be interesting to note that their motto, the Ahmadiyya Muslims' motto, is one of love. Malice toward none, love toward all. Very fascinating. Very fascinating. I'll miss Barrie. I did have a conversation with him shortly before he went into the hospital. It was basically catching up on old times and basically talking about the photos and some use of the photos and sharing with him how great it was to be with him and Rudy in Houston and how we needed to get together again. That's not to be. So let my words today, I hope, be seen by David and others who knew and loved Barrie. Barrie was my, like we like to say, brother from another mother. And I met his beloved mother. Our moms passed away about maybe a year apart. And I know how much he loved his mom when she came to that presentation in Pittsburgh, our mutual hometown. Barrie will be missed. And my thought is this: whether or not you believe Barrie was a Christian is up to you. However, when he sees that face, the face that he spent so many years studying, photographing, sharing, talking with people around the world with, it's only that person, the Lord Jesus Christ, that can say and determine whether Barrie was a true believer or not. Our opinions don't really matter. My opinion is that Barrie loved the Lord, and perhaps the only way he knew how to express it was by sharing the evidence that we all saw firsthand in Turin, and that he and I have continued to study, now going on nearly 50 years. Barrie, you will be missed. Thanks for allowing me to share my few thoughts about Barrie Schwortz.
Awesome. Thank you, Ken. And it was great getting your perspective as a fellow member of STIRP on that team all those years ago. So thank you for contributing that. And So yeah, at this point, I know a few of you said that you have to go, so you're free to go if you need to. But what I want to do now is I want to transition to Ken's co-author who wrote a book on the Shroud, Dr. Gary Habermas, and it was actually Gary who introduced me to Barrie for the to speak to him on the phone for those excellent long conversations in detail about the scientific evidence. So, Gary, over to you to take it away.
Thank you, Dale. Folks, this has been a very great discussion. I've enjoyed every single minute of it. There's so many things I could say from experience, but let me start with something about Barrie, a personal story like so many have shared already. And then, since Ken just spoke before me, let me tell you about a personal story with Ken, in which Barrie was a part. But like everybody, you call Barrie and you have a quick question. The quick question becomes a long conversation, and we had many talks. And because I've done a lot of work on the subject of the resurrection of Jesus, Barrie and I would talk about the resurrection quite frequently. He was as willing to talk about it or bring it up or ask me what I thought about this or that. And we would talk about it, and I would say, what do you think about this? And then what do you think the Shroud has to do with it? Because Ken and I had some pretty specific conclusions in our two books on the Shroud in 1981, and the second one was 1990. But so I was talking to Barrie, and he said, Gary, he said, I go out and I speak a lot. And he said, probably the group that asks me to speak more than any other group as a denomination, or whatever he called it at that time, he said, I go to a lot of Baptist churches. And come on, he said, I'm Jewish. And these Baptists would always come up to me and tell me about the gospel. And they'd want to tell me about the deity and death and resurrection of Jesus. And I'll listen. And he said, let me tell you something. He said, many Jewish friends of mine are greatly offended by this kind of activity, as if they're not God's chosen people. He said, but I'll tell you my perspective. And this revealed Barrie's heart to me like nothing I've ever heard before or since. But Barrie said, I want you to know that when these Baptists come up to me and talk to me about the gospel message, I am not bothered. I am flattered, and I'm joyous to hear what they're saying. And I said, now, what are you saying that? Why are you saying that? He said, because, let me tell you something. I asked myself, why do they want to tell me this message? And sure, it's from their perspective, and I'm Jewish, and they're not, and I'm not Baptist. But he said, it occurred to me one day that they were only telling me these accounts and telling me about the gospel and the New Testament and Jesus Christ because they loved me. He said, so the minute I started looking at these Christians as people who were concerned about me as a person and concerned about me not as a statistic, but as a person, I started enjoying every single time I heard the gospel message. And he said, let me tell you, I have heard it hundreds and hundreds of times. And that comment from him about why he was not bothered but blessed was just, it was just amazing. Ken and I got involved in writing a couple books, and I got to meet Barrie for the first time in Richmond, Virginia, for the 1999 Shroud of Turin International Research Conference there, Richmond, Virginia. And there were five members of Stirrup were present, and John Jackson and Tom D. Mahala and Barrie. And so he and I hit it off like he does with everybody. We had several conversations, and a book came out of that time a year later, and Barry's got a chapter in that. By the way, I should just mention this is another example of Barry's credit. A few years ago, some of my ex-students were kind enough to have a festschrift written in my honor. It's where you write a book and you honor somebody by writing your own essays, not about the person, but about something in your field, and it's an honor of this person. So here are all these people who are talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and Barrie, they asked Barrie to write a chapter, and Barrie said, absolutely. And he's got a chapter in this book, and he starts out and he says, I'm from an Orthodox Jewish family. Let me tell you my work. There's another essay in the book on the Shroud, and he just said, I want to talk about the Shroud of Turin. And he said, and much of the chapter was on how we know the Shroud is not an idol. How do we know the Shroud does not disagree with the book of Exodus and the 10 Commandments about worshiping images? He said, this is not an image, and if anybody should know, it's me, because I'm from an Orthodox Jewish family. And that was his chapter. So he's ever since then, over the years, what's that, 26 years, he's been a great friend, multiple conversations. Let me, since Ken just went before me, let me tell you a quick Ken Stevenson story. In 1978, I called Eric Jumper because I had just finished my PhD dissertation on the resurrection of Jesus at a secular university. So that's kind of odd, defending the resurrection for a group of philosophers and historians at Michigan State University. And when it was done, I heard about all this news. They're going to test the Shroud. I'd read a book on the Shroud a decade before, and I thought, I'm going to call these guys and see what's going on because of possible connection to the resurrection. So I started talking to Eric Jumper, and as I said before we started here, Eric said, hey, we've all signed a sheet of paper saying we can't talk to editors or interviewers. And I said, well, I assure you, I'm not a literary person. I'm not an editor. And he said, well, you sure sound like one, meaning the questions I was asking. And he said, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore right now. Now, he was not upset. Eric and I ended up having conversations later, but he said, I'm going to give you the name of our editor and spokesman. He was on our team, and you can call Ken, and Ken will talk to you like I can't, because that's his position. Eric gave me Ken's number. I called Ken that evening, and it was January of 1979, and they had already done the research and so on and so on. And that first night, Ken had already moved from the Air Force Academy down to New Orleans that he alluded to, and we talked on the phone for 3 hours, starting about 11 o'clock at night, and I think I got off the phone at 2 a.m. Eastern time. And a funny thing about that phone call, Ken, you know I've told this story a number of times, but I would be talking to Ken and I would say, hey, what did you discover on this? How many photos did you take? Who was doing that? Of course, Barrie and at that time, several others were photographers who went with the team to do the pictures. And finally, I got to the end of what I really wanted to ask Ken. And I said, Ken, is there any possible connection between the Shroud of Turin and the resurrection of Jesus? And I've got this conversation taped with Ken's permission. And Ken would say, all right, I'll tell you about that, but turn off your recorder. And I turned off my recorder. And he said, the data on the Shroud that may point to the resurrection are like this. And he would say 1, 2, 3. And I'd say, I'm turning my recorder back on. And he goes, fine. And we went on and talked about other things. About 3 times, I asked questions about the resurrection because of the research I just finished a few years earlier. And Ken said, turn off your recorder. I turned it off.
he told me some things and his opinion about the shroud and the resurrection. I said, Ken, I'm turning the recorder back on. He goes, that's fine. And then again later, turn off your recorder. He answered a few more things. And I said, the recorder's going back on. And Ken said, fine. Ken, I will always remember this sentence at the end of our conversation that night. But Ken said, can I ask you something now? I said, well, yeah, I don't know what you want to ask me, but fire away. He said, you say you're doing a book right now on the resurrection, right? And I said, yes. And he said, do you want to do one on the shroud? I said, I think that would be pretty interesting. And then Ken said to me, first time we ever met on the phone, Ken said, what do you say we co-author this book together? First phone call. What do you say we co-author this book together? And in 1981, our co-authored book was published. But even there, a lot of interaction with the Shroud members. By the way, Larry Schwalbe did the foreword for the book, and Bob Buckland, the team pathologist, did the postscript where he said he believed there was evidence on the shroud for the resurrection of Jesus. So Ken was on record that way. Bob said some things that hadn't come out before, and we were off and running. Anyway, I think that first story of Barrie's the main thing I wanted to tell. His comment about not being offended when Christians would talk to him about the gospel because it taught him that they loved him. They loved him enough to tell him about eternity. And I have never, ever forgotten that or failed to be moved by his comment there ever since that time. Thank you very much, Dale.
No problem. Thank you so much, Gary. And yeah, it was great seeing in the queue. I could see Ken's reaction to Gary's story. Say that was awesome. So yeah, thank you. Okay, so one thing I am getting notes from one of the guests, Arif Khan, who wants to get in, but he can't. So I'm gonna have to. Sorry, as the host, I feel bad. Oh, did someone take off? Okay. Okay, so I guess it's not a problem. So Arif, you can join now. But yeah, while we're waiting for Arif to come, I want to go over to the next person. And so someone who's really important, the current head of the BSTS newsletter is Michael Kowalski. So I think he has some interesting stories to share about Barrie there. So over to you, Michael. Oh, you have to unmute yourself there. And let me bring you up.
There we go. Thanks, Dale. Actually, unlike probably everyone, and certainly most people on the call, I've never had the pleasure of meeting Barrie in person, which is a real regret. But over the past 4 years, I've had a lot of email conversation and correspondence with him. At the time, I feel like I really have got to know him pretty well because Barrie, being Barrie, he wrote emails in a very personal way. However, I had known Barrie, or at least I'd known about Barrie, for a long time before then, because although I didn't really start taking a deep interest in the Shroud until about 8 years ago, it'd always been a topic that had fascinated me. And if there was a documentary on TV about the Shroud, I would make sure I tuned into it, or if there were newspapers or magazines with articles about the Shroud, I'd go and seek them out. And of course, quite often, Barrie would pop up in these things. And so I always knew he was one of the leading experts on the Shroud. But of course, as I started to delve deeper into the topic over the last 8 years, I very, very quickly realized just what a pivotal role Barrie had played over the course of the last nearly 50 years or so, both through his involvement with STERP and also everything he's done with Stera, with Shroud.com and so on. So it was immediately apparent to me just why Barrie had such a prominent position in the Shroud world and why he was a bit of a go-to man if a documentary maker wanted to get somebody to talk about the Shroud with real authority. Now, I remember the very first time I emailed Barrie with a couple of questions, and this was only about 4 years ago. And I was a little bit apprehensive because by then I knew quite a bit about Barrie, and I'd heard just how busy he was. The fact that he had to deal typically with 200 plus emails every day. So I must admit, when I sent off my email with my questions, I wasn't holding my breath, expecting a reply very quickly. And to be honest, knowing just how busy he was, I thought that any reply I received was going to be pretty short and to the point. So I was pretty surprised when I checked my email the following morning, because not only was there a reply from Barrie waiting there, but he'd taken the trouble to write a very helpful and detailed response, but also one which was really personal and warm. And it made me feel like he was already a friend, quite frankly, on the basis of one email. And that was typical of every single email that I ever received from him over the years, that every one of them, there was a personal touch to it. At the start of last year, I wrote to Barrie and I asked him if he would write an article for the British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter about what it was like to be a member of the STIRT team, working alongside those distinguished and extremely professional scientists who, back in 1978, were right at the top of their game. And I was absolutely delighted when Barrie said yes, and even more delighted when he seemed to be as thrilled to be asked as I was to have got a reply saying he'd be willing to do it. And in fact, he mentioned to me that he'd been itching to respond in some form or other to some disrespectful and negative comments that have been made about the STIRT scientists and their work, which had appeared in podcasts and blogs over the last couple of years. He originally intended to write, this was at the start of last year, and he originally intended to write an article and get it to me in time for the summer newsletter last year. But Barrie, having the commitments that he had, clearly other things got in the way. So it eventually appeared as the cover story of the December 23 issue. In fact, this is it. The article was called Enough. And it was basically Barrie just really taking the opportunity to set the record straight. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, one of the BSTS management team, Paul Bishop, he shared with me some emails because he'd written to Barrie shortly after that article was published to tell him how much he'd enjoyed reading it. And he let me read what Barrie had written in reply. And let me just read a part of that email, because I actually found this really quite moving at the time. He said, this is Barrie, writing that article was really helpful, and it gave me the opportunity to get it off my chest and on the record before my time is up. I was very happy when Michael liked my topic and agreed to publish it in the BSTS newsletter. And then I found out recently he made it the cover story. Awesome. Now, two things really struck me when I read that. I mean, first of all, there was Barrie's sincere gratitude that we'd published his article, and which, considering everything that he'd done over the years to publicize Shroud-related articles, books, videos, podcasts, papers, through Shroud.com, and also his own generosity of spirit, I just thought it was a perfect illustration to me of just how, not only how generous he was, but also how humble he was to be showing that gratitude. I mean, as far as I was concerned, it was a great honor for the BSTS to be able to have an article written by Barrie in there. But the words that really sent a chill to me were where he wrote, it gave me the opportunity to get it off my chest and on the record before my time is up. I, like Joe mentioned earlier, I couldn't have Barrie, he always seemed so full of life and so full of spirit that I imagined that he'd be going on for years and years to come. And yet, before the next, in fact, 2 days before the next newsletter was published, Barrie had passed away. I just find that really quite extraordinary that he'd put those words in there before my time is up. A few years ago, a very dear and wise friend of mine explained to me that, she said, we all have a life plan. We don't all know it, and we don't all engage with it, but everybody has a life plan. And we'll get opportunities in this life to connect to that life plan. And sometimes we take them and sometimes we don't, because we've got free will. But if we do, and if we do engage with it, and quite often it might be something that we'd never planned to do or intend to do or even want to do. But if we do engage with it, quite often extraordinary things happen. Now, when I look at Barrie's presentations, and I've watched many of them over the years, and quite often he talks about his life, and he makes the comment that he knows that God was using him to do his work. And when I look at that life, the fact that he never really felt committed to the STERP team until Don Lynn mentioned a few points to Barrie about how Jesus would have wanted a Jew to be on the team. That made him go. He then later struggled with being convinced of its authenticity for several years. But then as soon as he finally came to accept that the Shroud was authentic, well, everything seems to have happened from there. Barrie, he founded Shroud.com, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education Research Association. His photographs, there's probably never been a slide presentation on the Shroud that hasn't featured a photograph by Barrie. So loads of people around the world know of Barrie's work. And when I think that this was a man who, his role on the STERP team was perhaps one of the most humble of the roles. He was the documenting photographer. He wasn't a leading scientist who was going to be engaged in understanding how the image was formed. His role was documenting photographer. And yet, it's because of Barrie that all the other work is so well known today. And there's probably nobody who can claim to have done more than Barrie to raise worldwide awareness of the Shroud. So I'm sure he's done everything he needs to do in his life, and I found it really quite extraordinary that within a month of hearing that Barrie was seriously ill, he'd passed away. And I do think that was a grace. He didn't have to undertake all the dialysis, all the chemotherapy. I'm sure that there was some friends calling him and Jesus calling him saying, you don't need to go through that, Barrie. You've done all your work. Come and join us. So I'm sure there's been a party or two with the STERP members who've already passed and Barrie's family. And over here, we can treasure the memories. I know I do. And I know everybody else who's had connections with him will treasure their memory too. So thank you, Dale.
No problem. Thank you so much, Michael. And at this point, I do want to transition because somebody did mention, I think it was Ken, that how important the fact was that Barrie was not just helping Christians and that sort of thing. He was helping other faiths, including the Ahmadiyya Muslims. And I see here, better late than never. We do have Arif Khan, who has actually worked closely with Barrie and within the Ahmadiyya Muslim movement. So Arif, I want to go straight over to you to go ahead there.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, yes, my name is Arif Khan. I'm based in London. I'm part of a magazine called the Review of Religions magazine, which was established by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community over 100 years ago. And it's a comparative religion magazine. And I've always had an interest around comparative religion. We had covered the Shroud of Turin a couple of times, maybe 3 or 4 times over the last 20 years, before we had this interaction with Barrie. And originally, he was, as everyone's already mentioned, as soon as you reach out to him, very warm, very responsive, was able to help provide photographs originally to support other existing articles. But then further down the line, he wrote an article for the magazine specifically that we featured. I think at the time there was this theory going around about, is the Shroud a medieval photograph? So he came back and kind of disproved that, and we published that. Then for the next part of the story, I have to explain one of the traditions of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, which is a sect within the wider Muslim world. The Ahmadiyya community have this annual convention in the UK. It's been running for probably over 50 years now, and it's a gathering mostly for its own members. We typically get around 40,000 people gathering in the Surrey countryside, the English countryside, over a period of 3 days. The primary reason for that is for the community across the world to come together, enhance ties of brotherhood. We spend time with friends from the community and colleagues from multiple different countries who maybe we haven't seen for a while. But we also do invite external guests as well, members who are not part of the community, like politicians or other faith leaders and other community leaders from a range of all the faiths you can imagine, people from all over the world and all continents. What we started to do was the Review of Religion started to create an exhibition at this annual event as well, so that while guests and those maybe not familiar with the community are able to kind of learn a little bit more. But the primary, if you like, target audience for this community really was members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So that would be who would come to this convention. We had this idea that I wonder if Barrie would come along to this convention. And the idea was, well, he's just helped us feature, write this article, provide some material. I wonder if, we would be able to get him to come along to this event. And I was tasked with, why don't you get in touch with him and find out? So I'd only exchanged a few emails with him before. But as we all know, Barrie's so gracious and so generous with his time that, a couple of emails later, we were on a live video call, and honestly I was starstruck, to be honest. This was a man I'd admired, watched for 20 years, from when I've been interested in the Shroud, on documentaries, on major TV channels. So, and also, as we know with Barrie, he's very good at talking. So we were in full flow, and I was sitting there thinking, this is wonderful, I'm loving this conversation. How do I get this round to inviting this person who I've never met to travel halfway across the world, across the Atlantic Ocean, and come to the UK to attend a convention with a community he's never experienced or even heard of, really? And I was struggling. And I was very lucky, because he was talking about the last time he came to the UK, and he kind of gave me a lovely way to link in. He said, oh, I still have some money. I still have some British pounds there that I never got to spend. I wonder if I'll get a chance to spend this, £10 note, I think it was. And I was like, well, actually, Barrie, about that. And then again, what a wonderfully generous man. How amazing. As soon as I explained the idea to him, he not only was on board with it, but he took the lead in helping me, make it a better idea. So he said, look, that sounds really interesting. I know a lady called Pam Moon based in the UK. She has one of these replicas of the Shroud as well. And he didn't say, why don't you go and speak to her? He said, let me get Pam to buy into this idea. So immediately he was on board with us. He did ask for some information. I shared with some information about the community, the peaceful nature of the community. We shared some details about how it was different. And one thing I did notice as well, he did his research. He, when I did meet him and he was at the event, he had really read up on all of these sources and was able to, quote different statistics about how many countries the Ahmadiyya Muslim community was in, etc. So he really got on board, and he was immediately part of our organizing team, if you like. And the first year we ran this was in 2015. And I remember some nervousness just before we set up this exhibition. We had our own tent, probably about, maybe 10 meter by 10 meter, if that, maybe a bit smaller. And we had this wonderful life-size replica, and we had a few information boards, etc. Some of it was from Pam Moon, and some of it we had provided, but we were not sure if anyone would actually come along to this exhibition. It was not part of the main market. It was not part of the main event. Most people come, the feature speakers at the annual convention that lasts 3 days are there to listen to the words of His Holiness, our Caliph or leader, who is an international leader of the community. He delivers a keynote on each of the 3 days, and that's the main event here. So we were already a auxiliary, an add-on to a much bigger event. So we weren't sure what was going to happen. I was anxious that we hope we're not wasting Barry's time in any way. He understood it. I did pre-warn him. But something interesting happened in the opening address by His Holiness. He mentioned the exhibition specifically. He said, there's a replica of the Shroud of Turin. We have some experts on there. Be sure to go and see the replica. And then, of course, we had the opposite problem. We were overwhelmed with thousands, literally thousands of visitors over the 3 days to this exhibition. And one of my favorite memories of Barry was him afterwards turning to me, and he was like, have you guys seen the film Jaws? He goes, we're going to need a bigger tent, just like in Jaws, they say, we're going to need a bigger boat. So already on that first year, he was already planning the next year really with us. And one thing that was amazing was his generosity in terms of inviting other people as well. He helped us reach out to many scholars. We've repeated this for 5 consecutive years. And each time he helped us get more people involved. We had Bruno Barbaris, we had David Rolfe come along as well, Manuela Marinelli also, and Hugh Ferry, I think, as well. So, another thing, he was very open. Barry was always open, and it kind of came with the territory with what he did. Always open to Shroud skeptics as well as those that were believers and those that had very different viewpoints, about what the Shroud proved. He always took them on board, welcomed it, and allowed us to have the that exchange of information in a very respectful way. And I think that was something he instilled in all of us as well, was to kind of don't shut down different viewpoints, but allow them to be shared. In terms of the level kind of things got to with Barry, I think what happened was he was invited to speak at the main stage. So there was a section on the first day of the third day of the first year, where we would have politicians, heads of state from around the world come and say a few words. And Barry was given a slot where he was able to come and talk briefly for 2 or 3 minutes. And I remember speaking to him afterwards, and he would tell this story many times. He said, he saw the other politicians and people going up with written speeches and prepared notes. And he said, I had no notes and I was very nervous about this. But he said, he decided to just stand up and speak from the heart in terms of what he said. And, there's a video clip of him on YouTube. If you search for Barrie Schwortz and Jalsa or Ahmadiyya, it will come up. And what he said, I just want to quote what he said. He said, my role was to come here and share with you my knowledge of the Shroud of Turin. But I have to admit, in the 3 days I've been here, I've learned far more from you than you will ever learn from me. As I stand here and look at your motto, I can only look at myself as a shining example of your creed. And the motto is love for all, hatred for none. And he says that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community would invite a Jewish man to talk about a Christian relic at a Muslim organization. What a wonderful line. And I think he came up with it on the spur of the moment. But that literally, those words spoken on the main stage in front of, I think it was 10,000 people in the tent, but millions of viewers watching through satellite television. That immortalized him into, Ahmadiyya history, really. And also from that moment on, I couldn't walk more than about 10 meters at the annual convention with Barry with me without someone stopping and wanting to meet him and speak to him. So it was beyond his work on the Shroud. With the annual convention, everyone really from the community really took Barry into their hearts, because what he did, far more than the work on the Shroud, he was just a wonderful human being, always so warm and so willing to talk to anyone and everyone. And it felt there was a really nice relationship that was formed between members of the community, and Barry. The love was both ways. And sometimes he would often joke as well. He said, I get more love from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community than from my own Jewish mother, God bless her soul. And it was said lightheartedly, but that was one of the things that he did highlight to us. I was very lucky that, as well as these more formal engagements, I was with Barry, accompanying him at these events, making sure he knew where to go. There was some media commitments as well, with radio interviews and TV interviews. I also was the fortunate person who got to actually collect him from the airport when he would land in Heathrow. He would then come, to my house, see my family. He described them as his sort of London family. He said, your kids probably think of me as their crazy American uncle who visits once a year, kind of thing. So that was another, I'll always cherish those memories I had with him, and feel very fortunate to be able to build such an informal and personal relationship, as well as having, all of the great knowledge that he shared with us around the Shroud. during those conversations as well, like, you know, his successorship and death, the topic of death and passing away definitely came up. I remember him talking about how he established Stera for that exact reason, that, you know, the legacy will continue on. And he even spoke to me about, you know, one day he did say to me one evening, he was saying, like, you know, I just pray and I hope that when I am taken from this world, my body goes before my mind goes. And I think he was very conscious about people who can have longer illnesses, suffering from dementia and loss of memory and things like that. And he didn't want that, and he didn't want that burden on anyone. And I think we'll all agree that he was still very much at his sharpest when, sadly, you know, he was taken from us. And even if you look at the last few YouTube interviews and things on Barrie, he was on form, like, you know, right till the end in terms of the Shroud research. Just lastly, wrapping up, I was looking at my last few exchanges with him where we talked about the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. It was from April. This was before he was diagnosed with his illness. But we were just reflecting on that we had done this previously. Now he was kind of getting old and he wasn't really considering traveling to London again. So we were reminiscing a little bit. And he said, some of his words here was, he said, I have the fondest memories of my 5 years attending the Jalsa, and I still miss my friends in the Ahmadiyya community. I also realize how privileged we were to spend time with His Holiness each year. If you see him, please send him my warmest regards and my deepest appreciation of the time he gave us. I then responded and said that, you know, I echo your sentiments about the fond memories. I love how you became a core member of the team. So many people at the mosque ask me how I am when they meet me. They ask how my family are. And the next question is, how is Barrie doing? And I said to him, you definitely enter the hearts of many Ahmadis. And he wrapped it up by saying, I'm happy to hear that the Ahmadiyya community feels the same way as I feel about them. So yeah, wonderful man. What a wonderful you know, experience I had to share with him. I feel so grateful for that. I'll always remember those years, and a lot of it is being captured and will always be preserved on video. And yeah, finally, I just want to end with the Arabic words, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. To God do we belong, and to God do we return. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Arif. I appreciate that. So, yeah, and just one thing I noticed, you mentioned Pam Moon. So there are about 3 people who unfortunately, they couldn't make it out today, but I did pre-record with them their kind of speech. So I will be playing their recordings after everybody that's here live gets to go. So look out for that. But yeah, I think next I'm going to throw it over to my fellow Shroud podcaster, Guy Powell. So, yep, over to you. Let me bring you up.
Thank you, Dale. Appreciate it. Yeah, you know, you mentioned podcast. I met Barrie virtually, more or less on a podcast. But prior to that, I had written a book and I wanted to, you know, get and purchase one of the Shroud images that he had. And so I sent an email in, and he then actually called me back. And I was so surprised that he would take the time out to call me back. And we talked for a little bit. And the little bit turned out, of course, into about an hour and a half. And then I think it was probably 2 hours. And I finally said, hey, I got to go get some dinner. It's my wife is starting to bother, you know, starting to complain. But yeah, so many people have talked about him being willing to talk. And I was always very surprised about him being willing to, you know, to talk as long as he did and take as much time as he did. And whenever I had a question about the Shroud or shroud.com or whatever it was, you know, he would answer that question, and we would then, of course, talk for, you know, for so long. Right after I got done with my book, I wanted to start a podcast and a podcast series. And I thought, well, Barrie's probably, you know, he probably wouldn't say yes, but I thought I'd just go ahead and ask him. And I will admit I was very surprised that he, you know, he was willing to be on my podcast. So he was my very, very first podcast guest on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And it was kind of funny because then when we got to the scheduled time to do it, we got onto Zoom, and we're sitting there and talking on Zoom, and we hadn't even started the podcast yet, and we're talking, and probably an hour went by before we even, you know, got to the podcast. And I said, oh man, I wish I would have been recording all of that, because everything that he said was just so prescient and so interesting and so valuable. And he certainly, during that time and during other podcasts that I'd done with him, he educated me so well and was willing to, take the time and do that. It was kind of funny too, though. Here, you can see me sitting here, and we had been on, a handful of podcasts together, and I got to meet him. And Ken mentioned the National Museum of Funeral History, and Barrie was going to talk there, and Ken was going to be there, and Rudy Dichtel was there, and there was quite a few other folks there, Cheryl White and Myra Khan, and it was kind of funny. So we get out there, and and he showed up, and we're walking around. I'm walking around myself through the museum, and I hadn't really seen anybody yet. I got there a little bit early, and then Barrie, he was walking around, and we ran into each other there, and he says, "Man, Guy, I never realized how tall you were." And so he used to kid me about how tall I was, and he immediately started to call me, brother Guy, and I was always, he took everybody, and including me for certain, right into his heart, and he was so friendly, and immediately we were friends, and I really appreciated that more than could be imagined. And I said, the Shroud world is really represented by Barrie Schwortz and what he was able to do, and him being Jewish and the Shroud being Christian was, kind of an interesting dichotomy. And yet he was, he would talk about that. He said, well, whenever God wants something done, he'd send a Jew. And so, and Barrie was, I guess, one of those where he was being sent. And it's funny too. I always wondered, I never really, I asked him a couple of times what he felt about, the resurrection of Christ and Christ in general versus his Jewish background. And I never really, I'm not sure if I ever got a straight answer, but I know in my own heart that he is today with Jesus in heaven, and he's sitting up there looking down at us, and and probably, hopefully enjoying what we're talking about, and the tribute that we have for him. But I know that he is in heaven, and he is he had a great life, and that really was reflected in his friendship and in his actions and everything else that he did. Just a couple of other thoughts that always I felt were kind of fun, and I thought I'd mention is, he'd obviously talk about his Stirp time, and that here he is. Hey, I'm a Jew. Why would you want a Jew on, to go over to Stirp and do this thing and investigate this thing about Christianity? And he said, oh yeah, we'll go over there, and within an hour we'll be done, because we'll have found that it was a painting and it was a fraud and whatever. And then after 120 hours of nonstop work, he I think he realized that, hey, there is definitely something here, and I think that's I think that probably was a shaking of his faith, and he realized that he had to somehow rectify the fact that the shroud was not a painting. It was not a dye. It was not a scorch and everything else. It was definitely something that was unexplainable and potentially miraculous. I don't think he ever said to me, at least, that it was miraculous, but I think he probably believed that it was. He did tell some interesting stories. I remember him showing me a picture of this, some kind of a chemical bath or something that they had to set up, and they had to set it up in one of the toilets in the Royal Chapel. And it was just fascinating to to see that, and some of the things that they had to do to get water and be able to do whatever it was that they had to do. What a great storyteller, and really what a great believer in what the shroud represents. The other thing that I think was really funny, but also highly valuable, he said that at the end of the 120 hours, the Archbishop came in, and I can't remember who it was, but he said he came in and he said, "Okay, everybody, you've been so good about not directly touching the shroud with your bare hands and potentially contaminating it." He said, "I want you to take your gloves off, and now I want you to place your hands on the shroud." And then I think there was a prayer that was said, and Ken, you probably know more about that than I do, but so he was able to actually then, along with everybody else on the Stirp team, actually able to touch the shroud and put their hands on that, and that made him a secondary relic. And I remember him talking about that, and then, so I said, to him out at the National Museum of Funeral History when we met and when he spoke, I said, "Well, Barrie, I now have to absolutely shake your hand, because then you'll make me into a tertiary relic." And I tell that story to a lot of people. I think it was just phenomenal. And it really is kind of just kind of fun to to talk to him about things like that, and some of the little anomalies or little fun little cameos of interesting stories that take place. I remember him talking about Dr. Fry and using the sticky tape, and the Stirp team had come up with this applicator, and in the National Museum of Funeral History is the applicator, so that you would put the tape on. That was a special tape so that it wouldn't leave any residue that might show up in over the coming years and centuries and millennia. And so it wouldn't leave, that residue. And I remember him and all of the other scientists, they gasped when Dr. Fry took out his little roll of Scotch tape and put that, and applied the Scotch tape without using the applicator, without using this special tape. And he used the Scotch tape to, to collect his samples. And everybody just kind of said, "Hold on, don't do that again." And so there was an interesting story that way, and just phenomenal. And anyway, there's many other things that I could talk about. I had so many good conversations with him, and I enjoyed everything. But Barrie, I know you're looking down on us. I know you're blessing us and smiling now, and you've got your great personality and friends, and I'm sure you're making friends up in heaven. But I really want to thank you for everything that you've done, and may you rest in peace, and really appreciate everything you've done for me. Dale, thank you so much for allowing me to speak.
No problem. Thank you so much, Guy. I appreciate that. So, yeah, I think at this point, I want to look, me and Guy, in terms of podcasting and interviewing the Shroud experts, we're kind of newbies, because long before us, there was Russ Brault, who did amazing interviews, I think going back to the 80s or something like that. So, Russ, I want to turn it over to you to give your take on Barrie there.
Well, thank you, Dale. Barrie was certainly a special friend to me. We've known each other since we met in Turin in 1998. So I guess that's 36 years ago. And it was certainly an honor to be asked to be part of his board of directors. So the, Barrie's always said that he was going to write a book, but, he was so busy, he never got around to it. But he had the title, and the title of his book was, "This Was Not My Idea." And I always thought that was funny, because Barrie, it's just, he always wondered why he was selected to be part of this team. And I think he tells the story of, I think it was Don Lynn who told him, that says, well, listen, we know you're Jewish, but just go along with this, and one day you'll figure out why you're here. And I think it was 17 years later when he, in 1995, I believe, is when he started Shroud.com, which is really, having just written a book myself, and it was unbelievable how many times I accessed Shroud.com for various references and things. And so, part of the mission of Stera now, he was so wise to actually form a nonprofit so that it would continue on. And part of our mission then is to make sure that Shroud.com does keep going on and on and on into perpetuity, because it is such a incredible resource for the world of the Shroud. And some people have asked, a lot of people have asked whether Barrie was a Christian or not. Of course, everyone says, well, he's probably more Christian than any Christian I know. And it's, but I always accused Barrie of being more of an enigma than the Shroud itself, especially when it came to things like the resurrection. But I did have a talk with Barrie about maybe about a week before he passed away, and he was telling me how he was going to, at this point he was on chemo, he was doing dialysis, and he says, Russ, I really just want to take all this stuff off. I don't want this. And I said, well, Barrie, it's when it's time to go, it's time to go. And I asked him, I said, I hope you've made your peace with the man on the Shroud. And he said to me, Russell, what else could I do? And that was as good of an affirmation of faith as I think anyone would ever need or want. And it's so I think we all know where he is, and we'll meet him again, and without any question at all. Barrie was famous for using a quote from Sherlock Holmes, and I'll read it to you. And he always says this. He says, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And it's such a great quote that he used all the time to explain his involvement with the Shroud, because it's, as improbable as it may seem, that the Shroud could actually be the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, and why he would be involved in it. It's just that, when you've eliminated the alternatives, then as improbable as it may be, must be the truth. And so I've been to his apartment in Los Angeles a few times, and then of course he moved to Colorado. I've been to his house a few times, and Barrie, everyone here in these dedications has talked about how, talking to Barrie you can't talk to him for less than an hour. It's like you're in it for a 1 hour minimum. And it's and sometimes I would email Barrie, because I didn't have an hour, and sure, I'd email him a question, and sure enough, he'd call me, and we'd be on the phone for an hour anyways. And Barrie is just such a magnificent, magnanimous man, and he is be tremendously missed. We all know that, and it's I'll just leave it at that. It was a great privilege to be asked to be part of his board, and now the board picks up the work to make sure that we carry his work on for as long as possible. So thank you, Dale. I appreciate you allowing me to speak.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Russ. And all right, so the one universal thing I keep hearing from everyone is about Barrie's, the love that he had and those long phone calls. So at this point, I kind of want to bring in the one person who could actually talk longer than Barrie Schwortz on the phone, Teddy Pappas. So Teddy, I want to bring you up at this point to give your take on Barrie. Oh, and you're muted, by the way.
Well, all I can say is that a very close friend of mine gave me some very sage advice many years ago, and about people. And she said there are two types of people in this world. There are givers and takers. And our Barrie he was a giver. And he was, from about 4 years ago when I never had the honor and privilege of meeting him in person. Although I have had those marathon conversations. Ours would generally be anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. And in terms of our conversations, and they were always just such a tremendous joy. I'd always, when I'd finish a conversation with him, I would just feel so uplifted and joyous and just enthralled with all of the new things that he was teaching me and listening to the backstories of things. It was just, he always had a pep and a spring to his voice, and always such a big heart and a good heart. And I think that the classic word that describes him is the Yiddish word meaning mensch, and he was a mensch. And that's, I think a very high compliment to him. He helped me so much. Anytime, either when we would have discussions within the Shroud Science Group, when there was something that he had, good knowledge about, he was always quick to respond and give great explanations of things. And many times I would email him with questions, and sometimes I got some good explanations via email, but a lot of times it's like, well, it's easier to just talk about it. And I was, and so I'd get a call from him, and I would get so much wonderful information. And many times I would take notes with certain things that he would mention to me, because I knew that what information I was getting, it was from someone who was directly involved with that investigation. He was part of that. Barrie understood the tremendous, I don't know if responsibility is the word, but when someone is privileged to be involved in something, as he was involved in, having his hands on the shroud, studying it for 5 days, taking pictures of it, he knew that he had so much knowledge that others wanted and many people needed. And he felt that responsibility, and that's what prompted him. He said a friend of his had said something about, I'm sure somebody can tell this story better than I can, but something that prompted him, a discussion with a friend that caused him to then start Shroud.com, because he knew he had all of this information and he wanted to share it. And he properly felt sort of a responsibility to share it, because how many people are privileged with that information? And I have frequently given an analogy between the STURP members. They're like the apostles. They had direct contact, not with Jesus himself, but with the cloth that enshrouded Jesus, with his blood on it, with his supernaturally created image on it. And there's something incredibly special and very privileged about that. And so he has been, along with, there have been some other STURP members, Ken Stevenson included, who have been so good about being very active in disseminating that information. And we, people like me and people like you, Dale and Guy and others, who are very active right now, who have had the privilege, the immense privilege of talking with Barrie, of being able to call him friend. We're like the church fathers and mothers in that we've gotten information directly from Barrie and from Ken and from Larry Schwalbe when he was alive. And sometimes we get some information from John Jackson and Sam Pellicore and some other people. And so that there's a responsibility on us as well to then continue to disseminate that information where we're having that chain of custody, that provenance to the information as it passes, just like with the books in the Bible. And so Barrie understood that, and nobody could have possibly have done a grander job than he, with what he has done to disseminate so much information, and through his website, shroud.com, but also through the discussions that he would have with us and the emails. And I mean, he and I, we would talk about and sometimes debate about the issues of banding and the chin band and the coins and the ponytails and what the magnetic lasso did and did not do. And I've already I miss those conversations with him. But through his photography, he wasn't just a documenting photographer, because so many things in our discussions, he would give me backstory on information, but he also knew firsthand about so many things. And also with the, as Ray Rogers, as his dear friend and Sturt member Ray Rogers was dying of cancer, and he asked Barrie to publish his book, and Barrie, of course, certainly did. And he's preserved that information. And, you know, I can go back and read Ray Rogers's book, and I do. And there's so many details. I wish Ray were still here with us, because there's so many more things I'd like to ask him. But he understood the importance of preserving that information. And one of the things too, a lot of times, you know, he would help me. I have some questions on sticky tapes, or I had some questions. Not about a year ago, there was something where we needed to get in. I needed to speak with Joan Rogers, who was still with us, and hopefully she is still. And Barrie contacted her for me and told her that there was this, you know, lady that was needing some questions, because this had to do with work that Joan did with the sticky tapes. And so Joan, she responded, and as she goes looking through Ray Rogers's things, she found out Barrie thought he had all of Ray Rogers's Stirp stuff. She ended up finding out there was a box that had some additional information. I don't think Barrie's had. He initially got some information that I needed from it. He found the information that Joan told him about, but I don't know if he's had a chance to just go through the box. So you know, that I think there's going to be, who knows, some hidden treasures in these boxes. But I mean, it was so kind of him to always, you know, help me. And you know, gee whiz, I need lots of help. There were so many things, that technical details, things that I wanted to know, and he was the man that could answer them. And he was there, and like I said, he could give me the backstory, and so many of these backstories were just absolutely charming and funny, and just very enjoyable to hear. But when it was announced that the Shroud Conference would be in 2025, it was right after it was announced. I don't think I let a full day pass, maybe a day. And I emailed him and I told him, I said, well, no, you think a Jewish mother is, good at nagging. I said, you ought to check out Greek mothers. And I said, you can call me your honorary Jewish mother. I said, I'm going to wage a campaign to get you to come to the Shroud Conference in 2025, because I said, you're the heart and soul of Shroud scholarship. And it would be I've never been to a Shroud Conference. This will be my first. And I was like, I can't imagine it without Barrie Schwortz there. And that's when he told me that that he was having, kidney failure and was going to be going into the hospital. And so I knew about that just because of that email question. But he was always a man who was so eager to help people. And he had a life well lived. And I close with what he always said, which is warmest regards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Teddy. That was very beautiful. Thank you. So at this point, I want to move on. Look, Barrie wasn't just here for people on the pro Shroud side, people that believe that the Shroud was authentic. He also meant a lot to the Shroud skeptics as well. So, and with that, we happen to have one in the audience here, Hugh Ferry. So I'm going to give it over to you, Hugh, to give your take on Barrie.
Thanks very much, Dale. That's very kind of you to ask me to join in. I first met Barrie, as Arif will know, in connection with the Jalsa Salana in 2015. And in fact, I'd emailed him because I'd heard that he was coming across to England, and I said, would it be possible for us to meet, because I wanted to ask him one or two things. And I think he was responsible for getting Arif. He said, well, why don't you come along? Come and join the Jalsa Salana. And so he was one of the people who was responsible for persuading Arif to invite me to come along as well. And from my point of view, that first meeting with him and with the Muslims of the Ahmadiyya community really set my whole worldview on how I was to look at the Shroud, and how it meant so many things to people who had completely different views. So there were, sure enough, people like me who didn't think it was authentic at all, but who nevertheless thought it was extremely significant. And then there were people who did think it was authentic, but certainly thought it had nothing to do with the divinity of Christ or anything like that. So there was the Jewish view, the Muslim view. We had some Hindus there, at least one Hindu for 1 year. And so all these views emphasized that there were a wide variety of views that were fascinated in the significance and importance of the Turin Shroud, regardless of whether it was particularly an authentic relic or not. It has a significance far beyond its own authenticity, and I think Barrie especially realized that, being, as he said, a Jew talking about a Christian relic at a Muslim convention. Yes, he certainly. We would the days at the Jalsa Salana. It was 3 days, and they were often absolutely exhausting. We're full on. You'd get there at 9 o'clock in the morning and not stop talking until to the general public and until late in the evening, and then we'd go back to the hotel. And we'd just get a beer and sit on the veranda, and Barrie would carry on talking for hours and hours till anybody else who was there more or less fell asleep. So I remember from that point of view extremely well. from my point of view, especially, he was very interested in the facts and the science of things. He wasn't. I mean, he was appreciative of opinion, but he was very anxious that the primary sources should become available to anybody who wanted them. And one of the reasons, as people have said, why he started Shroud.com was not just to put in the views of various people, but to put in the papers, the scientific papers. He was really keen on papers that were published in proper scientific journals. And of course, his big heroes were John Heron, Alan Adler, and Ray Rogers, who were, as it were, absolute out-and-out dyed-in-the-wool scientists. He had a great respect for science as such. And to my mind, it's quite interesting that being a photographer, he could see both sides of the scientific discussion about the shroud, because photography is a not so much now, but it was in those days an absolute blend of physics and chemistry. And he very much saw that from the Sturt point of view, there were physicists, imaging specialists, the NASA imaging specialists like Gene Law and Don Lin, who'd worked on the Viking missions and things like that. And they were physicists absolutely to the core. And then you got your chemists on the other side. And of course, Barrie sort of did all his own photography work for a very long time, involving chemicals of this and that. So he very much appreciated that these people were scientists. They were not people necessarily who published opinions. They were people who published observations. And I think he was very keen on that. And the only time when he ever emailed me to say, look, you've got one or two things wrong here, they were never that he didn't approve of my opinions. He said you can have whatever opinions you like, but if you'd made a factual mistake, then he would correct that, and he was nearly always right. So that was his value to me was that he was always there to set up just particular inquiries that I made, like whether this or that photograph was a UV photograph or an ordinary light photograph or something like that. I was particularly grateful to him because it was something that I don't know that he bothered with a great many people to send me the files of all the Nitowski slides, the slides that Joseph Kolbeck and Eugene Nitowski made of all the sticky tape slides, and there are something like 200 photomicrographs of those. And they are absolutely fascinating, and I've studied them at enormous length. And he was as willing to share them with me as he would with anybody else who shared his opinion of the shroud, and that's another reason why I shall be extraordinarily grateful to him. I had the privilege of being there when he gave his address to the Caliph. Indeed, we met the Caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslims a couple of times, and which was an enormous honor. But while he was there, yes, talking, arriving on the podium with all these people sitting in front of him, and all the politicians who'd gone before with their typewritten speeches, suddenly looking up and seeing the huge banner at the back of the auditorium saying "Love for all, hatred for none." And I think in many ways, I won't say he changed his mind. He found that particular slogan encapsulated all the feelings that he had about his fellow man. And I think from that point on, he had a particular affinity with the Ahmadiyya Muslims. And he concluded his speech by saying that in America, we don't know enough about the Islamic movement. All we know is about 9/11. And he said, all we know in America is the bad news, and you are the good news. And that was tremendously popular amongst his audience, of course. But it also rang, and I'm sure he must have known about that. It rang particularly well with Christians who I mean, the word gospel means good news. And I think he wanted to spread a gospel of love for all, hatred for none, fellowship, understanding, and tolerance, and so on, which made him a very special person, quite outside the realms of Shroud studies. So yes, he meant an enormous amount to me. I don't think I want to say a great deal more, otherwise I'll just repeat myself.
All right, thank you so much there, Hugh. And at this point, I think we've covered everyone that is here live. But as I said, there were some people who, such as Pam Moon and others, who weren't able to make it. And I just want to play their clips so they can give their take on Barrie. So let me bring that up on screen. Okay, we'll make that full screen. Perfect. So are you guys seeing Pam Moon there?
Yes.
Yep, perfect. Okay, so
Yeah, I can see her.
Awesome. So here's what Pam Moon had to say about Barrie.
Dale, thank you so much for letting me speak about Barrie. It's such an honour to be able to do that. He was such a great man. And I just want to tell you a few of the stories of my dealings with him, my relationship with him, and just to say what an incredible influence he's been over me and my walk in the journey of sort of telling the story of the Shroud. So it started in 2008, and my mother had seen an image of the Shroud, a life-size black and white, of the front of the face down to the feet, and it had a huge effect on her. And I'd started to do some talks on the Shroud, and I thought, well, if I can get hold of a black and white like my mother had seen, people might have the same impact on them as it did on her. So I wrote to Barrie. I'd looked everywhere to see where I could find a copy of this, and the only place I could find was Barrie. And I wrote to him, not expecting a response. And of course, he wrote back immediately, as he always did. He worked so hard, I can't quite get around how hard he worked. But anyway, and he said, yes, you can have a black and white like I've got, but I've also got a life-size replica as the Shroud looks like to the naked eye that's 15 feet long. Would you like one? He'd made 4. So he'd made one for, I think, for Colorado. One went to New Zealand to an exhibition where I know that 10,000 people visited. It then went on to Manila, where I think hundreds of thousands of people probably went. And Barrie said that he was a bit overwhelmed. I think they treated him a bit like a rock star when he went to Manila. And then another one went to the underground church in a persecuted country. And I got the 4th, which was such an extraordinary honour. And I remember opening it up, the black and white and this life-size replica, and I remember crying. It was so beautiful because Barrie was such a good photographer. I mean, he was a young man when he was chosen to be the official photographer for Stirp, but my goodness, he had the talent. And so I put together an exhibition because the big Shroud was too big to just take to talks. And then my journey with the Shroud exhibition started, and I've been blessed to take it to lots of different places, to Westminster Cathedral in London and to Dublin Cathedral and various other places. And what I wanted to say really is that Barrie's image of the Shroud of Jesus has gone all over the world, and it's been seen by thousands of people. And I think that there is a difference between seeing it in its fullness, its entirety. I find that people will stand in front of it and weep, or they'll just be amazed, or their jaws will drop open with astonishment. I didn't know it was that big, all those sort of things. And we owe so much to Barrie in terms of promoting the Shroud around the world. Okay, so the next thing was I went to a conference in 2012, and David Rolfe, the great filmmaker on the Shroud, mentioned something about the carbon date being like a dead hand on people's interest in the Shroud. And so I started researching the carbon date and what had gone wrong, and I made a model, and I folded it to try and understand the water damage, the fire damage, all the different things, not the image itself, but just the cloth, what was wrong with the cloth. And started a correspondence with Christopher Ramsey, who was the head of science at Oxford, who he wasn't involved in the carbon date himself, he was a witness to it, but he then became the professor in charge of the department. And in that correspondence, it turned out that they had photographs of their shroud and the sample that they'd tested. And so I put a Freedom of Information request to get that information. And I put it out in 2014. Now, Joe Marino had organised a conference in St. Louis in 2014, and I'd like to go, but didn't have the money, and just thinking about it a lot. And it was a Sunday, and the conference started on the Thursday. And I thought, I don't know what to do. And I said a prayer that there would be a sign to say to go if I was to go. And by 12 o'clock, David Rolfe had written to me to say that Barrie had picked up my paper and put it online and to go to St. Louis. And I thought, okay, that's a good enough sign for me. So I went to St. Louis, and I went there because I'd got no paper, no presentation. I wasn't expected to give a paper, but someone had cancelled. And so 15 minutes I was allowed to speak on the Oxford photographs, but I had no presentation. And Barrie came to my rescue. Of course, he said, look, I'll find it on your website, I'll put it up on the screen, and you can talk from the photographs. And you know what? I was so nervous, and he was so wonderful. He made little jokes and got the audience at their ease. And, you know, it took ages for some of these photos to load, but Barrie made it all feel all right. And he had that human touch. He could just make people feel at their ease. Even though he had this enormous Mensa-style brain, and you know, anyway. So I was really, really grateful to him for that. But anyway, after the conference, there was a photograph that Oxford University had misclassified of the shroud, and when you look at it in detail, it shows that the shroud sample that they tested is orange. It's covered in sticky gum. You can see it on the image. It looks completely different to the images that Sturp took of the shroud. It's orange and it's covered in gunk. So I met Barrie and Joe and Bill Meacham, and together we delved into Ray Rogers' archives of what he discovered about what was on the carbon date sample. And that's another thing I wanted to say about Barrie. He just loved pure science. He loved great scientists. He loved peer review. So, you know, Ray Rogers ticked all those boxes. You know, for 35 years he worked at Los Alamos. Well, we've all watched Oppenheimer, haven't we? We all know that they don't employ people who don't know what they're doing at Los Alamos. You know, and so Ray Rogers had looked at the carbon date sample. He'd looked at it, analysed it. He got the samples of the Reyes sample, that is, and of retained sample from Turin, and he found Madarite dye. I've got it here. I wonder if you can see it. This is Madarite dye. You know, it's an organic substance, and he found a sticky gum. He hypothesized that it was either gum arabic or gum tragacanth. I went to a textile expert called Tereshima Roberts, who said that with linen you tend to use gum tragacanth. Now just think about it for a minute. Gum arabic is what is the sticky substance in chewing gum. You know, I asked children, have you ever had chewing gum stuck in your hair or on your clothes, and how do you get it out? Well, gum tragacanth, and this is what it looks like, is thicker but it's stickier than what holds chewing gum and gives it its stickiness. And the shroud was, that carbon date area was coated in this. And you know what? And one of the things I loved about Barrie was that he wanted the science. He believed Ray Rogers knew what he was talking about because he was a great scientist, you know, and he believed so much in peer review and all that sort of thing. And I admire that. And Barrie would say, if you look at the science and you look at all the evidence, 100 pieces of evidence that points to the shroud being authentic, and one piece of evidence, the carbon date, which suggests that it's not, you want to analyze that bit that's coming out with a different kind of result, you know. And then in 2015, I actually got to know Barrie a little bit better. So he was invited by the Ahmadiyyan Muslim community to go to their Jalsa Salana and to speak on the shroud. The Ahmadiyyan are a wonderful Muslim community. They don't believe in any jihad that is violent. Their motto is love for all and hatred for none. And they have some amazing people like Arif, I believe, who will be speaking, and Amer. And they were really open to discussing all sorts of stuff. But the reality is that Barrie was invited to a Muslim conference in a foreign country as an American Jew in 2015, after the wars in the Middle East, after the terrorism that had taken place, after the civil war in Syria. You know, and he thought seriously about whether or not he should go. But in the end, he trusted Arif, he trusted Amer, and he went. And so I saw him, and he said, "Would you like to bring your exhibitions?" Of course, yeah, I did. And I got to meet him for 4 days for 5 years running. And because Barrie is the man that he is, it meant that worldwide Shroud experts were prepared to come to the Jalsa. So 35,000 to 40,000 Muslims were addressed by some of the greatest Shroud experts in the world: Bruno Barbers, Emanuela Marinelli, David Rolfe. I could go on. So that was amazing. But I just want to talk about one thing that the Jalsa taught me, which was that the man of the Shroud has a bruise to his right cheek and a whiplash below the bruise. And Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua to Jews, and the prophet Isa, peace be upon him, to Muslims, and Christ to me, taught that if someone hits you on the right cheek, offer the other. Do not take up arms. Do not be violent. Stand up for what you know is true, but do not be violent. And people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. based their movements on that teaching of Jesus, literally on that teaching. And here was I in a conference with Muslims and an American Jew and Christians who were all prepared to try peaceably to understand the nature of this phenomenal cloth, which is the Shroud of Turin. So, I mean, it was such a privilege, but it taught me so much about the nature of what it is to try and follow the Prince of Peace, who talked about love, about our capacity as humans to rise above hate and to love one another. And so, you know, I just have so much thanks for Barrie that he taught me that. By his willingness to be open to go and speak about the Shroud all around the world. He was a great man, and we will really miss him.
Thank you very much. That was very beautiful. Thanks, Pam.
I hope I've done him justice. I don't think I have, but well, here we go. Okay.
All right. So that was from Pam. And I think it's important. First of all, you guys hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm on.
Yep.
Awesome. So I have another clip, but this is from someone a little bit different, because so far we've seen that Barrie had an impact on, you know, Jews and Christians and even Muslims with sharing his knowledge about the Shroud. But it's important to note that, look, even atheists and agnostics got a lot out of what Barrie had to offer. So I just want to play a clip from an agnostic named John Loken, who believes, in large part because of Barrie, that the Shroud is authentic. So here's a clip of John Loken giving his speech. Where did it? Go ahead.
So, hello there. Yeah, my name is John Loken, and of course, Barrie Schwortz, he left us just 3 weeks ago, approximately. Left us too soon. It went very quick, unfortunately. He was truly a great figure in the Shroud field and an objective defender of the Turin Shroud. He's probably the best ever, I would even say, in my opinion. He defended the authenticity of the Shroud, but also simply the mystery of it and respectably as a great historical mystery. And of course, he was a warm and funny guy. We all knew him for that. Little personal anecdote. I first met Barrie almost 20 years ago at a Shroud Conference. I was new to the field, had never met anyone at all. And I came down one morning in the hotel elevator, and the door opened, and there was Barrie Schwortz. Talk about welcomes. That was just terrific. He was friendly, of course, casual, and we talked a bit and then went into the conference room. Such a nice surprise to meet, first off, world famous figure like Barrie. I had been investigating the Shroud for a couple of years before then, and I barely knew of his Shroud.com website because I didn't have internet access at home, and I was mostly using the Bible, reading the New Testament and a couple of older books on the Shroud that I had found. So I was relatively new to it. Anyways, the conference was excellent. I met many other great Shroud researchers, experts, and so on. But I was surprised that almost everyone there seemed to be Christian. And when I was planning to come, I didn't expect such an overwhelmingly Christian audience. I myself, I'm agnostic. I was back then as well. And I was fascinated by the Shroud. And I assumed that a lot of other people like me would be. So it was a bit of a surprise to find not much of a mixture of people there. So in that regard, Barrie was very welcome to me because he was more in my grouping, you could say. There he was, a Jewish guy. He did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And he was perhaps mildly religious himself. I never really figured out what his precise stance was. He often called himself a secular Jew, but there was perhaps some mild religiosity to him as well. So we were kindred spirits in a way. We both shared the view that the Shroud was authentic, derived from Jesus in the first century. We shared the view that the image formed naturally, and that the body was dead. It was not live, not comatose, like some people theorize. So that's our basic similarity. Funny enough, though, or oddly enough, over the following years and decades, I rarely ever communicated with Barrie. There just didn't seem to be much reason to. I knew that I was a small timer in the field, newcomer, and Barrie was a giant and very busy with his Shroud.com and other commitments. So I didn't want to steal his time. We did have a couple of interesting telephone conversations, long ones too. Barrie speaking 95% of the time on autopilot. He was quite wordy, as everyone knows. So there's that. His communication style was excellent, of course. Everyone knows his written communication, just perfect grammar, perfect spelling, and so on, and always a calm manner as well. He generally avoided controversy, a very, very diplomatic man. Could have been a diplomat, a true diplomat somewhere or another, but he chose to be the ambassador for the Shroud in a way. He was a great host, organizer, speaker, but he could be brave and bold too. His theory of the natural image formation process was not a very popular one in the field. So he had to kind of walk a tightrope in that regard. Barrie was a bit of a mystery man to me as well. I recall one revealing encounter in Columbus in 2008 when several of us were talking out on the patio, and an idea suddenly popped into my head, and I wrote it down and put it in his chest pocket. And it was a question, and it was basically, if the image formed naturally and there was no resurrection of Jesus, what happened to the body? And I asked him if he would later on, in private, if he would maybe provide me with an answer. And a few hours later, he did so. He came up to me and very clearly and kindly, he said, "John, I have an answer for you. That's not my job. That's not my job. It's not my field. That's history. I'm an imaging specialist. And when he said that, I actually said to him, Barrie, I thought you might say that, and that's just fine. I know your position is a delicate one, and you have to be very careful about what you say. So that's just fine. And we never again talked anything further about the ramifications of a natural imaging formation. Of course, he knew that my own theory was that the body had been removed from the tomb, and that the image itself, the natural image, was what had inspired the resurrection belief of the disciples and the followers. So anyways, Barrie, yeah, he was a real acrobat in a way, agile acrobat. He had a tightrope to walk in the Shroud field. As a Jew and a non-believer in Jesus or the reputed resurrection, he knew he was working closely with many, many people who had strong views in that direction, fervent and emotional. But he played his role very well, stayed independent, did not get deep into theological differences. Whenever some Christians wrote about things like Satan, the devil, hell, he would not encourage them. He would simply avoid the subject. Wherever he is right now, up in the clouds, I hope, he may be relieved and sighing a long sigh of relief to be away from the controversies finally, because he has observed many of them. He was the most credible defender of the Shroud as a Jew, and was really amazing in doing so. He had no religious stake in it. Others in the field, even the highly respected scientists, have always had that tinge of ulterior motive or superstition and so on. But not Barrie. Barrie was a man of reason and only mildly religious, I think. So he was a perfect ambassador. Now, with him gone, we'll see what happens. We're entering into a period of, I think of it sometimes as AB after Barrie. It could change a bit without his moderating influence. But of course, he's always available still online on the videos that he did. Many of them recorded, and they're on YouTube now. So some last thoughts. He had many, many friends among the people in the field, not just Christians, Jews, of course, also, but other religions, atheists and agnostics, and myself. It's funny, though, I knew him perhaps least of all, or how can I phrase this? We didn't know each other personally at all. Again, very little contact, and yet I seem to be very, very close to him in my belief about the Shroud. So it sounds ironic to have so much in common and yet not communicating very much, but it's true. So anyways, thank you very much, Barrie, for being with us for so long and so with so much dedication. We are all grateful to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was great. All right. So, yeah. So I think that's it for all the clips that I have here. Oh, my throat. Oh, okay. So I think I'll just end off by kind of mentioning a few things about what Barrie meant to me, and there are three things I just wanted to highlight. So the first is what everybody knows, right? I was honored to meet Barrie through my friendship with Gary Habermas. It was Gary who first introduced me to Barrie back before I was a Christian. I was engaged on this religious quest, and it was important for me to figure out which religion, if any, is true or not. And key for me was that evidence. And, enter Barrie, a non-Christian. He doesn't have skin in the game kind of thing in terms of, whether Christianity is true or not. It was just purely the science. And we would have conversations over the phone for hours, as everyone's attested to, where he would tell me the evidence, and he would help me out by sending me papers or hooking me up with, certain experts that have argued this or that. And, through his efforts in a role, if it weren't for Barrie, I wouldn't be here as a committed Christian here today. So I always want to thank Barrie for his role in helping bring me to faith and playing that role. Also, similar after I became a Christian, similar to Guy Powell, in terms of podcasting, Barrie Schwortz was my very first expert guest on my podcast. I remember bringing Barrie on, and at that time I had an atheist co-host. So I remember, okay, I was a little nervous. Okay, is he going to come across properly and not offend Barrie or stuff like that? But as it turned out, they had a great conversation together. And, Barrie is that consummate diplomat where all sides just loved Barrie, and they had we all had a great talk and stuff like that. So I appreciate Barrie's role on that front. And the third thing that I always remember Barrie for is how caring he was, because I remember doing the podcast. So I'm friends with a Shroud skeptic named Nicholas Allen. We have mutual respect for each other, and he's supported me by sending me sources when we address his proto-photo hypothesis. But when we first met, it wasn't so friendly. So we met by him basically threatening to sue me for a show I did critiquing his proto-photo hypothesis there. And I remember kind of freaking out. This is my first, legal threat. So, okay, did I do anything wrong in that? And I reached out to Barrie for help, and he was very helpful, even to the point of saying, like, look, you've done nothing wrong. I have full legal permission for the photos. And he was even helping me to hook me up to a lawyer friend of his in Ontario. So, he was just there for you. When you needed him, no matter what it was, he would do everything in his power to help you and that sort of thing. And that's what I remember about Barrie. I think kind of in closing, I played that intro video where I think I highlighted what was most important to Barrie, his legacy of helping share that information that he was privileged to have and bring that to the people to whom it matters. He mentioned me, like people like me, but not just me, people like everyone. And he played such a role in bringing so many to faith in Christ, and that sort of thing through sharing that knowledge that he had about the Shroud. So I just want to say thank you so much, Barrie, for everything you did. And thank you to all my guests for coming on and sharing all these wonderful memories of this great man. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks for doing this, Dale.
Yeah, cheers, Dale.
No problem. All right. So take care, everybody. And if you're a Shroud fan, tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. I think it's at 1 p.m. We will be having Hugh Ferry and Jack Marquardt returning to debate the history of the Shroud from 501 to 900 AD. So look out for that, and have a great week, everyone.
All right. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.